You're making a grave mistake, Chancellor. A mistake that will haunt you. Ambassador Valthor Mern's voice was a controlled strike, every word delivered with the cold precision of a seasoned negotiator. He stood unflinching in the center of the council chamber, a stark figure against the opulent, towering silhouettes of the council members above. His uniform, black, with a subtle sheen, was cut to perfection, yet it did not shine like the gilded halls that surrounded him. There, the council's ruling elite sat in their towering thrones, looking down from their raised pedestals as if to remind everyone present of their superiority. Chancellor Phyros Valtar, his long, silvered fingers steepled together, leaned forward. The motion was deliberate, calculated. He had no intention of showing any sign of weakness. The Valdar, his species, were known for their slow, methodical deliberation and their belief in their own absolute infallibility. Ambassador Mern. Valtar's voice slid from his lips like silk, but underneath it, there was a bitter edge. Humanity's rapid growth has thrown the entire balance into disarray. It has become clear that your kind must be reined in. The Council has unanimously decided that Earth will be quarantined. Your species will no longer venture beyond Sol. Any attempt to defy this will be treated as an act of war. The air in the chamber seemed to freeze, the weight of the Council's decree pressing down like a storm cloud gathering above. Mern stood silently, unmoving, his dark eyes focused on the holographic projection of Earth, a blue orb now encircled by an impenetrable wall of warships. The tension was palpable, but Mern's expression remained unreadable. There was no sign of fear, no shock, just an eerie calm. Valtar's words echoed in the cold space, waiting for a reaction. The silence stretched, but Mern remained unfazed, his hands clasped behind his back with the stillness of a statue. "And you believe this will break us?" Mern's voice was almost a whisper, yet it cut through the air like a blade. Valtar's eyes narrowed. "You've been isolated, Ambassador, blockaded. All your ships are now useless beyond Sol. No more contact, no more trade, no more expansion. The galaxy has spoken. You will submit." Mern's lips barely parted, his gaze never leaving Valtar's. "You misunderstand me," he said, his voice as cold as the air in the chamber. "I'm not here to submit. I'm here because I wanted you to understand something. You've made a mistake. You're already losing, and you don't even know it." The room went still. The council members, for the first time, exchanged glances. There was no outburst, no display of fury from the human ambassador, just an unsettling calm. A few tense moments passed before Mern turned on his heel, walking toward the exit without another word. The sound of his boots echoed against the polished stone floor, the only noise in the still, oppressive air. "No threats?" Warlord Draxos, the Council's chief military strategist, growled from his perch, his voice low and rough. "No promises of retaliation? Just this?" Mern paused at the chamber doors, his back still turned to the assembly. He spoke without turning. "I don't need to threaten you. You'll learn soon enough." The doors slid shut with a low hiss. The council fell into an uncomfortable silence. The weight of Mern's departure lingered like an unfinished sentence. For a moment, it was as if the entire chamber had frozen in place. Only Veltar's strained voice broke the stillness. "Prepare the blockade," he said, his eyes glinting with the cold certainty of someone who believed they had already won. Hours later, the decree was in motion. The Sol system was sealed. Galactic patrols stationed at every jump point, their ships massive and menacing, guns trained on any human vessel that dared approach. The galaxy's trade routes closed to Earth. All imports and exports from humanity were severed. The economic chokehold had begun. But then, the most curious thing happened. Earth did nothing. No diplomatic protests, No clandestine operations to break the blockade, no fleet movements, not a single whisper in the comms, just silence. In the days that followed, the disappearances began. The first was a routine supply freighter, a solitary ship assigned to patrol the distant edges of Barnard's Loop. Its last transmission had been a standard systems check. Then, nothing. No distress beacon, no explosion, just a simple vanishing. Then another ship went missing, and then another. As the days passed, entire patrols vanished from Council records, their ships dissolving into the deep void of space, their last transmissions corrupted beyond recognition. At first, the Council dismissed it. Space was vast. Accidents happened. But as the disappearances escalated, even the most steadfast Council members began to feel the creeping unease. Finally, the unthinkable happened. The warship Black Fury, a prized asset in General Corps' fleet, disappeared without a trace. Its final transmission was an eerie patch of static, followed by faint, indistinct whispers, repeating one message in broken galactic standard. "Are you watching, Chancellor?" Veltar's face paled when he heard it. "The blockade is failing." Warlord Draxos slammed his fist onto the tactical table, his eyes blazing with frustration. "What is happening, Veltar? Where is this coming from?" The tension in the war room was palpable. A few council members stood motionless, their faces betraying the creeping fear they couldn't hide. The warships were supposed to contain Earth. They weren't supposed to vanish into thin air. And yet, they had. "Something's wrong," Veltar muttered, his voice heavy with realization. His confidence, once absolute, was beginning to crack. Behind him, General Corps' sharp voice cut through the haze of uncertainty. "We've been outwitted, Chancellor. Whatever they're doing it from the shadows." The Council was now confronted with a truth they hadn't anticipated. Their carefully laid plans were beginning to unravel. The greatest empire the galaxy had ever seen was facing an enemy it couldn't understand. And this time, the enemy wasn't even fighting back. The Council was not prepared for silence. Hours after the Black Fury had vanished into the dark, the chamber was thick with tension. Chancellor Veltar stood before a series of laser plasma displays, his eyes glued to the never-ending stream of updated reports. His fingers drummed nervously against the console, a sign of his rising unease. Around him, the other high-ranking officials shifted in their seats, some murmuring, others silent. Warlord Draxos, usually so composed in the face of battle, looked down at his hands. His usual confidence cracked. "The blockade is failing," Veltar muttered again, more to himself than to the others. His voice had lost its edge. "The blockade is falling apart," Draxos repeated. His voice had an edge to it now, low and dangerous. He stood, crossing the room in quick strides, the tension in his frame giving away his nerves. "We control the routes. We control trade. We control the galaxy's very movements. And still, humanity plays this game better than we ever thought possible." Veltar glanced at the screens. Ships, hundreds of them, disappearing without a trace. What should have been the most heavily fortified system in the galaxy was falling apart right before their eyes. "We were supposed to suffocate them," Heska, the trade minister, said, barely able to disguise the panic in his voice. "And instead, they're doing to us what we planned for them." Veltar finished the sentence, his voice strained. "This isn't just about warfare. It's something else. Something we didn't anticipate." The war room felt smaller, suffocating, even though it was one of the most advanced command centers in the galaxy. Every face that looked at Veltar showed a combination of confusion, disbelief, and the kind of fear that doesn't come from knowing what's happening, but from knowing what's coming. "We need answers," Draxos growled. His eyes bore into Veltar, an accusation without words. "They've broken our systems. Our ships are disappearing, our fleets shattered. It's not sabotage, it's something far more calculated." Veltar turned toward a secondary console. The image of a missing patrol ship, flickered on the screen. Its last recorded message, static, no distress signal, no explosion, just an eerie emptiness. "They're not fighting us," Veltar said. His voice was barely above a whisper. "They're erasing us." Heska looked at the display, his mind struggling to process what was unfolding. "This isn't war. It's worse than war," Veltar interrupted, his voice tinged with dread. "We've underestimated them. We've made a terrible mistake." A quiet moment passed before a new transmission flashed across the screen, startling everyone in the room. The words were simple, but they burned through the air with the weight of a prophecy. "You thought we would beg," the transmission began, its tone cold and calm. "You thought we would fall in line." Another pause. "You should have thought harder." The message cut off abruptly, leaving the council members in stunned silence. For a long moment, no one spoke. They all just stared at the now empty heads-up display. The words of the human message lingered, a stark reminder of the power they had failed to recognize. "This is bad," Heska muttered under his breath, leaning over his console. His fingers hovered above the controls as he struggled to find words. "It's not just a rebellion. This is something new, something we're not equipped to handle." Draxos finally spoke, his voice low, a rare note of doubt in it. "What happens now, Chancellor?" "They're inside our systems. They're erasing our fleets, and we still can't find them." Veltar didn't answer right away. He stood still, staring at the void beyond the planet's orbit, his mind trying to piece together the unthinkable. Finally, he turned back to face his council. "We go after them," Veltar said, his voice unwavering, though the doubt in his eyes betrayed him. "We mobilize everything we have, every ship, every fleet. We hunt them down. We find the source of this interference." "But where?" Draxos demanded, his fists clenched. "We don't even know where to start. They're hiding in plain sight, and they're already dismantling everything we have." Veltar's lips pressed into a thin line. "We'll force them to show themselves." Elsewhere, in the dead of space, Admiral Tyron Vex stood in the control center of Erebus Station, his eyes locked on a laser plasma display. His face, as usual, betrayed no emotion. The station was located deep within a system that the Council had long considered beyond reach, hidden from even their most advanced sensors. "Do they know we're watching?" Commander Jorik Valtrin asked, his voice tinged with amusement. Vex glanced over at Valtrin, his expression unreadable. "Not yet, but they will soon enough." The projection before them flickered as new data streamed in. Thousands of human warships had activated, silent and invisible to the Council's sensors. They were shifting into position, their movements careful, deliberate. Vex's eyes narrowed as he watched, his mind calculating their every move. "They thought they had us cornered," Vex said softly. His voice was calm, but there was a fire burning beneath. "They thought they could keep us contained, but this is far from over. Now we control the game." Valtrin studied the display, his arms folded across his chest. "How long before they realize what's happening?" "They won't," Vex replied, a slight smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. "Not until it's too late." The silence that followed was thick with anticipation. In the distance, the Council's fleets, those that remained, were beginning to move, but they were already too late. Their ships were misfiring, their systems failing. Vex had known they would crack. They had never been prepared for an enemy that didn't need to fight back. "They still think this is a war," Valtrin said, a note of dry amusement in his voice. "They're not even close." "No," Vex murmured, his eyes fixed on the coordinates in front of him. "This was never about war. It was about control." The fleet movement slowed as the remaining Council ships began to stumble through space. The data pouring in from their patrols showed growing confusion. The humans hadn't engaged, they hadn't made a single strike, and yet the Council was losing. Vex's voice cut through the silence again, sharper this time. We're not waiting for them to come to us. It's time to send the message. Back in the Council's command center, Veltar stood at the center of the room, his gaze locked on a newly updated fleet status report. His hand tightened around the console, a flash of frustration crossing his face. The war was not going as planned. Ships continued to vanish. Entire patrols were lost without explanation. Then, without warning, the power went out. Veltar's eyes widened. He reached for his comms, but there was no response. He turned to the room, his voice sharp. "Where are the backup systems?" But there was no answer. Nothing. The entire fleet had gone silent. "Prepare for immediate action," Veltar barked. "I want full mobilization now." His words were lost to the chaos building around him. Every officer, every fleet commander stood frozen, watching in disbelief as their control systems flickered out one by one. And then, the words came again. The same message. You should have thought harder. In that moment, the Council realized they were not fighting humanity. They were fighting something far darker, far more insidious, a force that had already won without ever firing a single shot. The lights flickered in the command center of the Council's flagship, the unyielding Vengeance, casting shadows over the tense faces of the remaining officers. Veltar stood motionless before the primary heads-up display, watching as the status reports continued to trickle in. The data was fragmented, corrupted. Entire sectors were dark, fleets gone, their last known locations lost to the void. "They're not responding to our commands," Warlord Draxos growled, his voice edged with frustration. "We've sealed off every hyperspace lane. No one should be able to bypass our blockade, and yet they're slipping right through our fingers." Veltar's hands tightened around the console. His knuckles whitened as he stared at the spinning map of the galaxy, watching as his fleet's lines of defense seemed to dissolve into thin air. "They're not slipping anywhere, Draxos. They're rewriting the game." The words hung in the air like smoke, choking the remaining hope in the room. The Council's fleets, once an impenetrable wall of strength, had been reduced to chaos, their movements erratic, their systems compromised. "They've already won," Veltar muttered, his voice barely audible as the weight of the realization hit him like a physical blow. His eyes flicked to the flickering transmission that had arrived just minutes ago, the same chilling message. "You should have thought harder." The comms were filled with static, the transmission barely audible as it cut through the airwaves like a distant mocking whisper. But it wasn't the message itself that held his attention. It was the implications of its source. "Where are they coming from?" Draxos demanded, his fists clenching, the veins in his neck bulging as he spoke. He stepped forward, closing the gap between him and Veltar, his presence like a wave of fury in the room. "They've breached every system, outsmarted every attempt to trap them. This is no longer a war. It's a game of ghosts." "Exactly," Veltar said, his eyes darkening, "and we're the ones being hunted." Elsewhere, on the fringes of the galaxy, the Ghost Fleet moved with silent purpose. Admiral Tyron Vex stood at the center of Erebus Station's command deck, his gaze fixed on the data streaming in from across the galaxy. Ships, thousands of them, moved in silence, their energy signatures masked by advanced cloaking systems. The Council had been blind to the fleet's existence until now. From the shadows, Commander Jorik Valtrin spoke, his voice low and filled with anticipation. "They don't even know we're here yet, do they?" Vex's lips curled into the faintest of smiles. "Not yet." The strategic projections on the laser plasma display before them shifted, revealing an intricate map of the Council's fleets. They were spread thin, scrambling to reinforce areas that had already been compromised. Their defenses were breaking down, piece by piece, and all the while the Ghost Fleet, hidden within the folds of space, waited, silent, deliberate, watching, "We can take them now," Valtrin said, his eyes glinting. "Strike when they least expect it." Vex shook his head, his expression unreadable. "Number not yet." Valtrin furrowed his brow. "But we've prepared for this. The Council's fleet is in disarray." "True," Vex acknowledged, but his voice carried the weight of experience. "But there's a greater game at play. They've underestimated us for so long. It's not enough to simply destroy them. We need to make them realize that they never had control." Valtrin took a step closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You want them to know how they lost?" Vex nodded slowly. "Exactly." Back in the Council's command center, the weight of the situation pressed heavily on everyone in the room. The once proud leaders of the Galactic Council were now reduced to scrambling for answers, their faces betraying the unease that had begun to take hold. "Their movements aren't random," Veltar said, staring at the data once more. "They've been planning this. This wasn't a response to our blockade. It's a long-term strategy." Warlord Draxos slammed his fist onto the console, his anger evident. "And yet they're still hidden. If they have the power to bypass everything we've put in place, why haven't they shown themselves?" Veltar's eyes narrowed as he focused on the intricate patterns that were emerging. "They don't need to. They're playing with us, testing us. They want to see how far we'll go before we realize we've lost." The truth was undeniable. The Council, in all its might, had been outmaneuvered at every turn. "Send out the remaining fleets," Veltar ordered, his voice hardened by desperation. "We'll push them into the open. Force them to fight." Kor, who had been standing at the back of the room, stepped forward, his jaw clenched in frustration. "We've been playing their game from the beginning. They've led us into the dark. Our ships, our fleets, everything is compromised." The sound of his voice seemed to reverberate in the now still room. The words landed like a stone in water, rippling across the minds of the Council members. "Then what do you suggest?" Veltar demanded, his voice sharp. "We stop playing their game," Kor replied, his eyes burning with a fierceness that was unmistakable. "We end this. Now." Veltar's gaze flicked to the heads-up displays as the last of their fleets began to move into position. "It's too late for that. We can't undo what's been done, but we can still strike." Elsewhere, deep in the cold of uncharted space, the Ghost Fleet began to position itself for its next move. The time to strike had come. The transmissions they'd been waiting for had finally arrived. The Council was about to learn just how hollow its power truly was. Vex's fingers hovered over the controls, his mind calculating each move with deadly precision. The fleet was ready. Every ship, every drone, every weapon was poised to strike. But it would not be a simple battle. No, this was more than that. "We're not attacking them," Vex said, his voice low, his eyes locked onto the screen. "We're forcing them to confront the truth." Valtrin raised an eyebrow, understanding dawning on him. "We'll make them see their own failure." Vex nodded. The Council thought it could control the galaxy with fear. Now they'll learn that fear is their own undoing. The Ghost Fleet surged forward, their weapons locked and loaded. The first wave of attacks didn't come from direct strikes, but from the subtle sabotage of the Council's systems. Ship navigation was corrupted. Communications were intercepted. Entire fleets were reprogrammed, turned against their own commanders. The Council's mighty fleet, once the pride of the galaxy, began to fracture, not from outside forces, but from within. And then, the final blow came. A single message blinked across the Council's communication network. "You never had control." The message, chilling and final, sent ripples of panic through the command center. It was not a threat, not a demand for surrender. It was the cruel, undeniable truth. The Galactic Council had never been in control, and now the galaxy belonged to the humans who had outlasted them. The Council's final push toward Earth had begun. Their last armada, A vast fleet of dreadnoughts, carriers, and assault vessels moved in perfect formation, an unyielding line of firepower aimed straight at Seoul. Every ship in their arsenal was primed for war. They believed they were marching toward victory. But as they advanced, something felt wrong. Warlord Draxos stood at the heart of the command deck, his eyes fixed on the heads-up display. A steady stream of fleet reports flashed before him, each one more troubling than the last. Despite the massive size of their armada, their movements were sluggish, clumsy, like a wounded beast stumbling through the galaxy. "We should have been in Seoul hours ago," Draxos muttered, frustration creeping into his voice. "Why are we still out here?" Beside him, Veltar stood motionless, his gaze hard. He refused to show weakness in front of the others. "They're testing us. Let them come." But Draxos was not convinced. "Testing us? With all their fleets crippled, they're nowhere near as formidable as they once were. So why are they still moving like this?" "I said, let them come," Veltar snapped, his voice colder than ever. "We'll meet them in Seoul." Meanwhile, far away, deep in the heart of uncharted space, the Ghost Fleet was already waiting. Admiral Tyron Vex stood silently, his eyes narrowed in concentration as he surveyed the incoming transmissions on the heads-up displays. The Council's fleet had been methodically dismantled piece by piece, with no sign of the humans' true strategy yet revealed. It was time to end this. Valtrin, his trusted second-in-command, approached with an expression that mirrored the tension in the air. "The Council's last push is in motion. If we make our move now, we'll crush them." Vex's lips curled into a faint smile. "We've been playing a long game, Commander. The Council is too far gone to even realize what's happening." Valtrin studied the displays. "And they won't even know they're beaten until it's over." Vex nodded. "Exactly." He turned toward the tactical panel, his fingers brushing over the cold surface as he inputted a series of commands. The stations across the galaxy were set in place, ready to enact the final phase of their plan. There would be no dramatic strikes, no final showdown. The humans had done their job. Now the Council would collapse under the weight of their own insecurity. Back at the heart of the Council's fleet, Veltar paced before the display. His mind raced, but his movements remained rigid. "Do you see this?" He turned to Draxos, who had just analyzed the latest fleet movements. "They're still missing. Every attempt to track them has failed. Why can't we find them?" "They've hidden themselves well," Draxos said, gritting his teeth. "Too well. These humans have been playing us from the start. We're being led into the dark." "It's not about them hiding," Veltar snapped, fury slipping into his voice. "It's about us not understanding how they fight." Draxos let out a low growl. "They can't just be gone. They must be somewhere." Veltar's hand clenched into a fist. "They've been playing the long game. They want us to waste our resources. They're not interested in fighting us head-on." A loud buzz interrupted the tension in the room, followed by a transmission flickering onto the screen. A new message. It was short. "You've lost." Veltar stared at the words. His blood ran cold. "No." He took a deep breath, trying to remain composed. "They're not finished yet." Deep within the Council's war rooms, the atmosphere was strained to its breaking point. Panic was beginning to settle in. The walls of the once proud empire were crumbling. Officers and commanders shuffled, unsure of what to do. Some tried to reassure themselves with half-formed excuses. Others watched the heads-up displays, praying for something, anything, to change the tide. But nothing did. Instead, another transmission came through. The heads-up display flickered, the signal struggling to stabilize. The words that followed were not a demand nor a threat, but a final statement of the inevitable. "You're out of time." On Erebus Station, the command center hummed with quiet intensity. The time had come. Vex had already given the order. It was time to push forward with the final phase of their strategy. "Are they ready?" Vex asked, his voice calm. Valtran's voice came through the comms, steady and reassuring. "Everything is in place. The Council won't see this coming." Vex nodded. "Good. This is it." The display in front of them shifted, revealing their next move. The Ghost Fleet would no longer remain in the shadows. They would strike directly, but not with brute force. No, this would be different. This was the culmination of everything humanity had been planning since the Council had attempted to trap them. Valtran's eyes narrowed as he watched the countdown for the next operation. "They still don't understand, do they? They think we're just hiding, running." Vex didn't answer right away. His eyes were fixed on the display. They never understood, and that's why they're losing. Back in the heart of the Council's fleet, Veltar watched in disbelief as his once mighty ships turned on each other. It began with the first confusion in their systems, an odd glitch in the navigation data. Ships fired upon each other, targeting allies instead of enemies. Chaos spread like wildfire. In minutes, fleets were fractured. Crews panicked, unable to regain control of their vessels. Their own technology betrayed them. "How did they do this?" Veltar demanded, his voice shaking. "How are they—" A soft voice interrupted him, coming from one of the officers. "Chancellor, it's happening. The AI systems are rewriting themselves." "Shut it down," Veltar ordered, but his voice lacked the confidence it once had. "Reboot the system." But the command was too late. His voice had no authority. The Council's fleets were crumbling. Across the galaxy, the Ghost Fleet launched its final assault. Silent warships, some once Council vessels themselves, turned against their former masters. They moved like phantoms, dismantling the Council's technological stranglehold from within. The battlefields were empty. The ships were there, but their crews were gone. All that remained was the aftermath of their destruction. Abandoned stations, lifeless capital ships drifting through space. No one had fired a shot. The battle was over before it even began. In the Council's command center, Veltar collapsed into his chair, his hands gripping the console. The war was no longer a conflict. It had become a collapse, a disintegration of everything they had fought to control. "You should have thought harder." The final words echoed in his mind, louder than anything else. The realization came too late. The Council's power was gone, and now, for the first time, Veltar understood the true meaning of defeat. They had never been in control. The laser plasma displays flickered, casting harsh, cold light across the grim faces of the remaining Council leaders. The command center had become a graveyard for their former empire, their empire of power and precision, now crumbling into irrelevance. Veltar's breath came in shallow gasps, his hand trembling as he gripped the edge of the console. He looked at the data streaming across the heads-up displays, only to see more bad news. The remnants of the Council's fleet were scattered, isolated, and disoriented. The attackers were invisible, systematic. They didn't need to fight. They were watching. "How long before we're completely cut off?" Draxos asked, his voice strained, unable to hide the fear gnawing at the edges of his words. Veltar turned his head slowly, his gaze colder than the empty space outside. "We're already cut off," he said, his voice a brittle whisper. "And we never knew it." Another transmission came through, but this time there was no cryptic message, no warning. The screen simply showed a ship's schematic, one of the Council's most prized warships, the Marauder's Fury. It was drifting in deep space, its systems offline, its crew vanished. A sinking feeling clawed at Veltar's chest as he watched the empty vessel. "It's happening again," he murmured. Draxos stepped forward, his posture rigid with rising panic. "How? How are they doing this? How are they reaching inside our ships without us even knowing?" "We never understood them," Veltar said quietly, "and we never will." On Erebus Station, Admiral Vex surveyed the battlefield unfolding in real time. The final phase had begun. His fingers moved swiftly over the control panel, setting the sequence into motion. This wasn't about military tactics anymore. The destruction of the Council had already been set in motion. The Ghost Fleet was no longer confined to the shadows. They had become the shadows. "We have them cornered," Valtrin said from across the deck, his voice low and satisfied. "They'll never see us coming." Vex didn't respond at first. His gaze never left the tactical map displayed before him. "Don't underestimate them." Valtrin raised an eyebrow, his expression slightly bemused. "You don't think they can still turn this around, do you?" "No," Vex said slowly. "But they still have the capacity to surprise us." Back in the Council's war room, Veltar's voice broke the silence. "If they can take over our ship so easily, why aren't they striking now?" Draxos let out a low, bitter laugh. "They don't need to strike. They've already won." "They want us to understand that," Veltar muttered. He clenched his jaw, the frustration evident. "They've been toying with us from the beginning, and we fell right into their hands. That's why they're silent," Draxos snapped. "Because they don't need to do anything. We're doing it for them." Veltar turned sharply toward Draxos. "Enough! I need solutions, not whining." The officers in the room exchanged uneasy glances. The very idea of finding a solution seemed increasingly impossible. They had once believed the Council was invincible, yet now it was clear that their grip on the galaxy had been an illusion. "Set course for Sol," Veltar ordered, his voice now lacking the sharpness it once held. "We will confront them there." As Veltar's orders were transmitted to the fleet, the chaos continued to mount. Vex's fleet, now fully in motion, was a phantom force, slipping through Council defenses like a blade through soft flesh. Every time the Council thought they had them pinned down, the Ghost Fleet vanished, reappearing elsewhere, leaving only confusion and destruction in their wake. "You still don't understand," Vex muttered to himself as the tactical displays updated. He wasn't just defeating the Council, he was rewriting the rules of the game. Valtrin leaned in, watching the screen as Council warships began to disintegrate from the inside. The best part? They're doing it all to themselves. In the heart of the Council's fleet, the unyielding Vengeance, the flagship of Veltar's own command, drifted toward Sol. Their final assault was in motion. However, Veltar's mind was elsewhere, caught in the endless cycle of failure and disbelief. "Why haven't they attacked yet?" Draxos asked again, his patience at an end. "Why the silence?" Veltar didn't answer right away. His eyes were focused on the data streaming before him. No new transmissions, no new orders from the fleet. The silence was like a weight pressing down on him, squeezing the air from his lungs. "It's not silence," Veltar said slowly, the realization dawning. "It's the calm before the storm." The Council fleet finally entered Sol's outer boundaries. But instead of an array of defenses, stations, planetary shields, armed fleets, they found nothing. "Where are they?" Draxos shouted, his voice a mixture of fury and disbelief. "We've reached Sol! Where are the humans?" The fleet stopped dead in its tracks, the silence on the comms now deafening. The last bastion of their strategy had crumbled without a shot being fired. "Something's wrong," Veltar said, his voice cold as ice. "We've been led into a trap," Draxos spat, his eyes wide with panic. "It's all a lie, a distraction." Veltar stood motionless, staring at the display. It was clear now, the humans weren't running, they were waiting. "They've already won," he said softly. In the hidden recesses of the galaxy, the Ghost Fleet remained unseen, still waiting. Vex and Valtrin watched as the Council's fleet staggered in disbelief. "They thought they could find us in Sol," Valtrin said, his voice a quiet, satisfied murmur. "But we never intended to defend it." Vex nodded. "We never needed to." The Council had spent all its effort chasing shadows, believing they had control. But it was humanity that had orchestrated their fall, silently, methodically, and with a precision they would never understand. And now, the Council was forced to confront the one thing they had never prepared for: the true power of the human will to survive. As the Ghost Fleet moved in for its final strike, Veltar's mind was a whirlpool of confusion. The ships that remained under his command began to falter, communications corrupted by unknown forces. Panic set in as entire warships, once symbols of invincibility, began to shut down one by one. "You were never in control," echoed the chilling words of the mysterious transmission that had haunted them. And in that moment, Veltar knew the truth. The war had never been about brute force. It had been about control, and the Council had lost it. The silence surrounding Veltar was suffocating. The Council fleet hovered at the edge of Sol, the once unthinkable idea now planted firmly in his mind. They had failed. His hand trembled as it rested on the console, but the rest of his body was still, every muscle locked in a fight against the overwhelming sense of panic that had gripped him since the battle began. The warships that had once commanded terror across the galaxy now looked like ghosts, abandoned in the quiet of space. Draxos's voice broke through the tension, but it did little to ease the growing dread. "Where is everyone?" His eyes were wide, flicking between the laser plasma displays, the distorted images of their ships flickering into blank spaces, disappearing like shadows under a rising tide. "Where's the fleet?" Veltar's eyes were glued to the data streams, but he could make no sense of what he was seeing. Every command was unresponsive. Every ship in their fleet was slowly, surely, becoming a distant memory. "They've been wiped out," he muttered. The statement was almost nonsensical, as though it were beyond comprehension. It wasn't supposed to happen. The Council, in all its arrogance, was supposed to crush humanity under the weight of its fleets. Instead, they were falling apart from the inside out. Draxos's voice rose with urgency. "This isn't possible. You saw the reports. We had them cornered. They're supposed to be running, scattering. Why aren't they?" "Because they're not running," Veltar said, a chill in his tone. "They never planned to." In the heart of Erebus Station, Admiral Vex was unfazed by the chaos unfolding across the galaxy. His fingers moved across the console, giving orders with calm precision. He had seen this before. The Council had relied on their machines, their fleets, their weapons of mass destruction. What they didn't realize was that they had put too much faith in a system that could be subverted, redirected, and eventually shattered by a force they couldn't comprehend. Valtrin stood by, his eyes scanning the fleet reports that appeared on the heads-up display. "They still haven't figured it out," he said, more amused than anything else. "They're running in circles." Vex nodded. "They never understood their own dependence. They thought they were in control, but in the end, it was always humanity pulling the strings." Valtrin's lips curved into a slight smile. "And now they've realized it too late." Vex's gaze remained fixed on the data, the lines of enemy fleets appearing on the tactical map as mere blips, then fading from existence with disturbing regularity. "This is only the beginning." Back aboard the unyielding Vengeance, Veltar's face was ashen. His command center had become a hive of confusion. Officers exchanged frantic whispers, unable to grasp the full scope of the disaster they were now living in. "Where are the reinforcements?" Veltar snapped, spinning on his heels to face his command crew. "Why hasn't anyone made contact with the home station?" The officer at the console swallowed hard, fingers shaking as he scanned the communications logs. "There's nothing, sir. All comm channels are dead. No signals are coming through." Draxos's voice broke in, a bitter laugh escaping him. "Of course. They've isolated us. They knew exactly how to cut us off. The blockade, the ships disappearing, it's all part of their plan. Veltar's eyes burned with barely contained rage. We were the predators, he hissed. We were the hunters. How did we let ourselves become the prey? Across the galaxy, the Ghost Fleet moved closer, but this time, they weren't hiding. They didn't need to. Their plan had already been set in motion. Vex had seen the cracks in the Council's armor long before the first ship disappeared into the void. Any signs of resistance? Vex asked, his voice devoid of emotion as he studied the display. No, Admiral, replied one of the officers. We've been monitoring the transmissions. The Council's fleet is isolated. Their command is fractured beyond repair. They don't even know what's happening. Vex's lips curved into a tight smile. They'll never understand how it all unraveled. Back in the heart of the Council's remaining command, Veltar's frustration reached its peak. I will not go down without a fight, he growled, slamming his fist against the control panel. Get me answers. Now. A younger officer rushed forward, his voice trembling as he delivered the news. We've lost contact with the entire fleet. Veltar's grip tightened around the console. His mind reeled. No, this can't be happening. We can still win, Draxos muttered, a shadow of the man he had once been. We can strike back. We still have our weapons. We can fight them. Veltar's gaze snapped to Draxos, his eyes hard and unforgiving. No, he said slowly, as if testing the weight of the word. We've been fighting them all along, and we didn't even know it. The Ghost Fleet was now in position. Their ships, invisible to the Council's sensors, moved like shadows through uncharted territories. In a way, it was almost fitting. The Council had always relied on their sensors, their systems, their overwhelming force, and now, those very systems were betraying them. Vex leaned forward, eyes scanning the final report that had come in. We've waited long enough. Valtrin raised an eyebrow, his voice low. Are they ready? Vex turned to his second-in-command. It's time. Bring them in. At the Council's command center, Veltar watched helplessly as one more message flashed on the laser plasma displays. The text was brief, but its weight carried the full impact of the collapse that was occurring around him. You should have understood. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. It wasn't a demand, a challenge, or a threat. It was simply a truth. Veltar felt the cold sting of it, piercing deeper than anything the humans had done to them. It wasn't just a loss of ships or fleets. It was a loss of everything they had ever believed to be true about themselves. And the humans had known it from the start. In the final moments, the battle that Veltar had prepared for never came. Instead, the Council was swallowed by their own fear, a fear they could not overcome. They had faced off against an enemy they could not see, and it was that fear that would destroy them. The Marauder's fury was gone. The unyielding vengeance was a lifeless hulk. The ships that remained were nothing more than drifting tombs, abandoned by their crews, abandoned by their leaders. The fleet that had once held the galaxy in its grasp was now nothing but a shattered, disjointed nightmare. And as the last remaining officers in the command center looked around, they realized something. The fight had never been about ships. It had never been about soldiers. It had always been about control. And now it was gone. Vex stood in the command center of Erebus Station, the final reports coming through the display. The Council's reign had ended, not with a final battle, but with the weight of their own hubris crushing them. The fleet had fractured, the economy had collapsed, and their very system of control had been turned against them. There's nothing left, Valtrin said quietly, his gaze drifting toward the final flickers of the Council's broken transmissions. Vex nodded. They've failed. But humanity... He paused, his voice cold. We're just getting started. The last vestiges of the Council's once imposing fleet hung like broken monuments in the cold void. Veltar sat rigidly in his command chair, his eyes glazed as the reports flashed on the laser plasma displays before him. A low, constant din reverberated throughout the war room, a chorus of failures that now echoed against the stark walls of the Council's shattered authority. The control systems that had once ensured their superiority over the galaxy now seemed like archaic relics. Nothing was functioning the way it was supposed to. Ship after ship disappeared from their ranks, swallowed by an unseen hand that neither sought nor needed recognition. No weapons fired, no final confrontation awaited them. Only a blank, oppressive silence. "You see it now, don't you, Chancellor?" Draxos's voice was low, devoid of its usual fire. It seemed an effort to even speak. "You've lost." Veltar turned sharply to his second-in-command, his jaw clenching. "This is not the end. They can't have—" He broke off mid-sentence, the weight of the words choking him before he could finish them. He glanced back at the laser plasma display. Task forces were vanishing into oblivion with no warning, no sign of their destruction. Just nothingness, the void of a collapsing empire. Draxos leaned forward, his hands pressed firmly onto the table as if attempting to ground himself in the presence of something he could no longer control. "The humans don't need to fight us, not anymore. They've already won." Veltar's gaze swept the room from officer to officer, as if expecting someone to refute what Draxos had said. There was no reply, not a single word. No one could dispute the truth now. His mind flicked to the ongoing transmissions that had now turned erratic and unintelligible, corrupted by a force that he could not understand. Deep within the quiet corridors of Erebus Station, Vex observed the growing chaos in the Council's last stronghold with an almost detached satisfaction. He stood before the tactical map, his hands clasped behind his back, while the data streams continued to collapse one by one. "Did you expect this to take longer?" Valtrin's voice broke through the tension as he stepped beside the Admiral. His smirk, thin but ever present, remained undisturbed by the unraveling of the Council's carefully constructed empire. "They were never in control, were they?" Vex's eyes flicked over to him, the faintest trace of a smile crossing his lips. "They thought they were, and that's what kept them moving in circles." Valtrin raised an eyebrow, glancing at the darkened sectors of the station. "How long until they realize?" Vex's voice was like ice as he replied. "They won't. By the time they understand, the entire structure will be gone. They'll have nothing left to hold on to." Back at the heart of the Council's crumbling bastion, Veltar's gaze was fixed on the unreadable display, as if he could will it to change. But no matter how many times he adjusted the controls, no matter how many times he demanded a status report, the results remained the same. Nothing. The fleets were gone, their forces were scattered. The Council was crumbling before his eyes, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. "What's happening?" Draxos asked again, his voice filled with disbelief. Veltar didn't answer immediately. He watched as yet another fleet disappeared from the map, consumed by the same force that had claimed every other vessel before it. The deep space patrols, the recon teams, the heavy-class battle cruisers, all gone. Like they had never existed at all. "They're not even fighting back," Veltar said at last, his voice hollow, as if the words had no weight. "We're not even facing them." He slammed his fist onto the table, the sound a sharp crack in the thick silence. "I should have known. This wasn't a war. It was never meant to be. They were always prepared." "We should send a message," Valtrin suggested, his voice low and knowing. "Let them understand what's really happened." Vex nodded, his gaze focused. "They already know. It's already too late." Back in the Council's war room, The officers gathered around the display now seemed like ghosts, shifting uneasily, unsure of what to do with the void they now inhabited. There was no more leadership, no more strategy. Their commands had become meaningless. Veltar clenched his fists at his sides as another fleet disappeared from the map. The Council's military might was nothing but a fading memory. "Are we still in control?" Draxos asked, though he knew the answer. His voice had become a whisper, as if asking the question aloud would somehow bring the truth into sharper focus. The question hung in the air like a distant echo. "We never were," Veltar muttered, his words thick with bitterness. He turned away from the screen. How did we miss it? Back on Erebus Station, the message was ready to be sent, but Vex waited for just a moment longer. "No point in waiting," he said with finality. "It's time." He typed a single line into the terminal. "This is not your galaxy anymore." The message sent, and the ripple across the galaxy began. Within minutes, the transmission reached all the far-flung corners of the Council's once dominant empire. And with it came a shift, a realization, that the galaxy Veltar and his council had so fiercely ruled was no longer theirs. What was left of the council's fleet would soon find itself scattered in every direction, leaderless and directionless. In the heart of the war room, Veltar had one final realization. The final message had been sent. The final phase had begun. It wasn't a confrontation that humanity wanted. It wasn't war or dominance. It was a quiet, relentless reclaiming of what had always been theirs. "Let them try to rebuild," Veltar whispered under his breath, his body sagging with defeat. "There's nothing left to rebuild." The laser plasma displays flickered again, this time with a different message. "You never controlled us. We never needed you." Across the galaxy, the remnants of the Council's empire trembled. Fear spread like wildfire as those still loyal to the Council realized that the balance of power had shifted. They were no longer the hunters. They were the hunted. And for the first time in years, the galaxy felt a quiet peace. A peace humanity had always known was theirs, though it had taken every ounce of patience to reclaim it. As Vex looked out into the black void, his fingers lightly tracing the holographic interface, he knew one thing for sure. This war had been won without a single battle fought. The galaxy had never belonged to the Council. It had always belonged to humanity. The last transmissions from the Council were little more than frantic pleas that echoed in the empty expanse of space. Veltar sat at the center of the room, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, his gaze unfocused, lost in the void of his mind. The galaxy he had ruled with an iron fist for so long was now reduced to a fragment of what it once was. No fleets remained, no leadership, and no power. The remaining worlds, once under their thumb, now floundered in their uncertainty, unsure of what the future would hold. But one thing was clear. The galaxy no longer belonged to the Council. It had never really belonged to them, not entirely. They had always relied on the ingenuity of others, the quiet efforts of a race they had underestimated. Humanity. "You thought we needed you," Veltar muttered to himself, the words now a bitter, hollow reminder of his arrogance. The war room, once full of purpose and order, now felt like a tomb of their own making. His fingers drummed softly against the console, the laser plasma display casting a cold light on his gaunt face. The universe had shifted, and Veltar was left holding the remnants of an empire that had never truly known control. On Erebus Station, Admiral Vex surveyed the last of the reports, his eyes scanning the fading transmissions from the dying remnants of the Council. The systems that once held their military might in place had crumbled under their own weight. The Ghost Fleet, having executed their final move, had dismantled the power structure piece by piece, reducing the Council's control to nothing more than a series of failed signals and empty threats. "We've seen their last gasp," Valtrin said, his voice matter-of-fact, though it held the satisfaction of someone who had watched the collapse of an institution they'd long scorned. "It's over." Vex's expression remained unchanged. It was over the moment they cut Earth off. He glanced over to Valtrin, his eyes cold, reflecting the finality of their victory. "And they will never understand why." Valtrin nodded, his eyes fixed on the map of the galaxy. "What happens now?" Vex was quiet for a long moment. The answer was inevitable. "We rebuild. The galaxy is ours now, but not just for us." He gestured toward the final transmission they'd sent out. The message was simple, yet profound. "This is your new reality. The sky no longer belongs to you." Back in the heart of the collapsing council, the power was still flickering. Veltar had tried everything, sending commanders to reassert control, reactivating systems that were beyond saving, attempting to create a semblance of authority, but it was futile. The message had already been delivered. The council was finished, and there was no coming back. "What do we do now?" Draxos's voice was low, the question a reflection of the despair that hung in the air like a dark cloud. Veltar, now standing by the display, finally turned to face his remaining officers, the few who still clung to their positions in hopes of salvation. He didn't answer right away, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. When he spoke, his voice was a shadow of its former power. "We'll hold this place for as long as we can," he said, his words more out of habit than hope. "But the war is over. Humanity never needed our permission to do this. They always had it, and we were blind to that truth." Draxos looked at him for a long moment before responding. "Then we have nothing left to protect." Veltar didn't reply. His mind was already on the next move, the final steps that would lead to the dissolution of the council. It would not be violent. No final shots needed to be fired. There were no more weapons to aim, no more battles to fight. They were defeated, not by an overwhelming force, but by their own arrogance, by their refusal to acknowledge the humanity they had so deeply feared. The council had been built on a foundation of fear and control, but in the end, it was humanity's silence that tore them apart. They never needed to fight to win. On the fringes of the galaxy, the first traces of a new era began to form. As the council's power dissolved, the human fleets, hidden, silent, and ever watchful, moved into position. They were not conquerors, not invaders. They were witnesses to a shift, to the quiet recalibration of the galaxy. Admiral Vex and Commander Valtrin stood in the observation room of Erebus Station, the last of the Council's leaders, now nothing more than a footnote in the history they had written. "Do you think they know?" Valtrin asked, a question that had been lingering since the first message had been sent out across the stars. Vex's gaze was fixed on the deep space projections, watching as the last of the Council's fleets drifted into oblivion. "They never will. They'll never understand how easily we outlasted them." A soft exhale escaped Valtrin as he leaned against the viewport. "Do you think they'll try to rebuild?" "No," Vex said, the word firm, final. "Not this time. They'll fade away, and the galaxy will move on." Back in the heart of the ruined council, Veltar's final command was issued. It wasn't a declaration of war, nor was it a desperate attempt to reclaim what was lost. It was a surrender, not of their fleets or their worlds, but of their will to dominate. A quiet admission that their time had passed. And so the final message was sent to the galaxy, a reminder to every world, every species, every empire that had once bowed to the Council's will. "We never needed your permission. The galaxy has always belonged to us." With that, the galaxy shifted. Slowly, but irrevocably. The once stifling power of the Council had crumbled under the weight of its own system, and in its place, a new order began to take form. Humanity's silence had been the weapon that shattered the Council, and now it was their strength. They would no longer be kept in the shadows, no longer confined by the politics and structures of an empire that had never understood them. As Vex stood alone in the observation room, he knew that this was the final act. The war was over, and the galaxy was free, and it was humanity's time. The final transmission was sent. The galaxy would never be the same. And as the Council dissolved into the dust of history, humanity stood at the forefront of the galaxy they had always belonged to, their place now solidified in the void that had once been ruled by others. And with that, it was done. The galaxy was no longer theirs to take. It had always been theirs. The Council had banned humanity from space. Humanity had simply stopped caring. And now, the galaxy belonged to them.